In my last video, I unveiled this XY table for the belt grinder. With the addition of a magnetic chuck, it can be used as a surface grinding attachment. If you haven't already seen that video, I recommend watching it first because this one will make a lot more sense if you already know how it works. But just for a quick recap, it can be used to grind large workpieces. It can be used with any attachment in either orientation, so you can do all sorts of interesting grinds like radiuses, ledges, rabbets, internal corners, hollow grinds. It's really great for working with small workpieces because you don't have to hold them. You can just clamp them down and keep your hands well away from the belt. And it's really great for huge work surfaces like this that a normal surface grinding attachment can't do at all. Check out the unveiling video for more about how it works, but this is the detailed build video. I want to give you a quick look at the plans. This is a very detailed 37-page document. This will help you kind of decide how you want to make it, and then this table will help you decide what length you want to make the table surface. Some information about linear bearings in case you're not already familiar with those. And then we have the shopping list. So here's the materials. Here's all of the hardware and parts needed. And then here I also have a shopping list for tools. Here we get into actually making stuff. So here you have all of the parts that you need to cut with a little image of them. And for the more complicated parts, we have printable templates. This 2-piece template is for the table surface, and you can adjust it to whatever length you need. And on this page, there's instructions for how to use that template. And then we get into the actual assembly. So this is just telling you how to position parts and where to weld them together. And at the very end of the plans, we have regrinding the table surface. So you can use these templates and the instructions on the following page to make yourself a jig, which you will then use to regrind your table surface. And then at the very end, we have some troubleshooting in case you run into any problems. If you buy the plans, you will get a download link where you can download this document as a PDF. Also included with your download will be some DXF files for CNC cutting. Obviously, that's super optional. I don't have a CNC machine, so I'm going to be using my paper templates. I check the templates before cutting them out to make sure that they printed the right size. We have two different pointers here. One is for a left-hand infeed screw and one is for a right-hand infeed screw. I'm going to be using a right-hand infeed screw, so I'll just discard this template. Once all the templates are cut out, we can glue them on. I'm just using regular glue stick like you probably used in school for this. It even holds the template to this HDPE. The table template is customizable, so you can make it however long you want, and it has these marks for where the centers go. So I already cut the right half off because I know that I'm going to be using 340mm rails, and I cut the corners at an angle because it's easier to line them up here. So you can just line up the center for 340mm rails mark here with the same mark on the other template. After center punching all of the holes in here, then we attach this template. Make sure that you got this center one punched before you attach this because you're going to cover it up. And I'm going to go ahead and chop these corners off at an angle just like I did for the main template because that'll make it easier to align. And now we can center punch these 3 holes. I'm countersinking all of the holes so that when I tap them, they won't raise a burr. For tapping, I like to use a block of wood with a hole in it to keep the tap straight, at least to start the tap. I'll precisely position the linear rails, and then I'll just use them as a drill guide to drill the holes that will hold them on. I'm first using a drill bit that just barely fits the holes, so it will stay perfectly centered, and just using that to make a little divot at each location. Make sure the rails are actually centered side to side when you're doing this. I found that kind of easy to forget to do. And now with all of the positions precisely marked, we can finish drilling all of those through with a smaller drill bit. And then tapping all of those for the small screws that will hold the rails on. And that's the table surface all done, so we can move on to making the flexures. On the thin metal parts, I find that I prefer to drill it with it still attached to the full sheet because I just have more to hang on to. And I found that the best method for doing this was to use a small pilot bit. Then I'm coming back with a step drill to enlarge the hole. The step drill requires too much pressure to start and it will actually deform the sheet. So the small pilot hole is just there to reduce the amount of pressure it takes to start the step drill. For cutting the thin sheet without bending it, I've tried a jigsaw and the bandsaw, but I find that a fresh, very fine-tooth hacksaw blade is what really does the best job. Support the work very close to the blade and then take very light cuts. Don't really put any pressure on it, just let the weight of the saw do the work. I find a wire wheel is the easiest way to deburr these parts, and you do want to deburr them because sometimes you'll be running your fingers against these when you're putting it in the table holder. On this template, I've included the little crosshairs that are at the center of these radiuses. So if you want, you can use a large drill bit to create those finger notches. It's a bit wasteful though, because you have to have extra material all the way around, so I'm not going to do it that way. I drilled and tapped the hand wheel before cutting it off because I wanted to just have a little more material to hang on to. And I should point out that it's totally fine if you want to use an off-the-shelf hand wheel instead of making one. The main advantage of making it is it will be thinner, and so it won't stick out as far, and that could be good for space constraints. For making the dial, I'm just using a hole saw that has about a 1-inch inside diameter. And after I've drilled almost all the way through, I enlarge the center hole. At this point, I don't need the pilot hole anymore because the hole saw will guide itself. That way I end up with a 1/2-inch ID and a 1-inch OD. To make 10 evenly spaced marks around this dial, I made this template, which I can just clamp it on top of. The final version of the plans include this template, so you can just print it out. You don't need to make it from scratch. You could totally just draw the marks on, but I wanted them to be a little more permanent, so I cut them in with a hacksaw and a triangle file. Another optional step, but I added numbers to the dial using number stamps. This is the top of the infeed stage. It's a very simple rectangle, but it has a bunch of drilled and tapped holes. The small ones are all for holding the linear bearings down. There are a few other even simpler parts, but I think you already get the gist of how these parts are made. So I'm going to skip all of the really simple ones. Okay, I have all of my parts, both the custom-made ones and the store-bought ones. So now we can go ahead and start welding all of this together. For the infeed screw, we need a partial hole on this one piece. So I have to bolt on this sacrificial piece so that I can drill and tap that. Once it's drilled and tapped, I can take the sacrificial piece off. It won't be needed anymore. A lot of these pieces get chamfers so that when they come together, they create a nice V that I can fill in with weld. These two assemblies are identical except for the thread block with the tapped hole. Be extra careful when you get to this point. It's really important to put the top of the Infeed stage in the right orientation. I just clamp all of the pieces onto a block that's the right length, and then use a square and things to make sure that everything's nice and straight. And here I'm double checking that I have the top in the right orientation, comparing to the plans. Here I'm just moving the block a little bit further away from where I'm going to be welding so that I don't burn it. And then I can weld solid all the way across the ends. I had left that sacrificial block in place until now just to protect the threads, but now the bolts have to come out in order to weld. Leave this clamped up for the entire time while it cools, because that will help prevent it from warping. One more piece gets welded onto this, and it needs to be bent slightly. This will act as a spark shield to keep the sparks off of the bearings. The weld was preventing this from sitting flat, so I had ground that off. I'm using the linear bearings and this piece of flat bar as a reference to figure out how high I need to mount the spark shield. I want just a tiny gap above it so that it doesn't rub the bottom of the table. And now I need to be somewhat careful when handling the Infeed stage because I don't want to bend the spark shield. It'll be protected once it's all assembled correctly. This piece needs to fit in the gap in this Infeed stage just perfectly, so I'll custom grind that to length. The nice thing about custom grinding it now is if your Infeed stage warped at all, you can correct for that. This is still a little too tight. It needs to fit along with the two flexures because those are ultimately going to be between there. This is perfect. It fits without any play, but it falls out if I let it go, so it's not tight. Now that I've ground it down to the perfect length, I can drill and tap 3 holes in each end, and those will be used to hold the flexures on. Now that that part's done, we can weld it onto the table post, which is just an 8-inch long piece of square tube. I ground the end of this piece of tubing perfectly square so that I can just clamp the top plate directly against it and it will be registered square. When doing the long weld on this side, you'll likely warp the top plate just a little. I haven't found that that really affects anything, so don't worry about it. I paint the dial black and then I sand off the surface so that it leaves the black paint only down in the numbers and in the marks, and then I put on a clear coat to prevent rust. I painted this black just because all of the other controls and knobs and locking handles on the grinder are black. Now all of the parts are done and painted, and I can do the final assembly. The bolt that goes in the center front of the Infeed stage has all of the markings filed off of the head, because that's the bolt that the Infeed screw is going to reference against, so we want it to be smooth. I'm using this extra flexure from one of my prototypes as just a shim to space the parts a 1/16 inch apart. I make sure the 2 parts of the Infeed stage are even across the sides, and then I can bolt the flexures in place. This is the Infeed screw. It has a point on the end so that it always contacts in the same place. I just made this by cutting off a fully threaded grade 8 bolt and then spinning it in the drill while running it against the belt grinder to create that sharp point. I wrap the bolt with some paper and don't grip it too tightly because you don't want to damage the threads. There you can see the point I'm talking about, as well as how it contacts the bolt that I filed the markings off of. This is the pointer, but before it can be used as the pointer, it needs to have a slight jog bent into it so that it doesn't contact the dial. The bolt on the left-hand side gets a couple of washers so that this plastic block will sit level, and then that bolt will get completely tightened down, which will prevent the plastic block from shifting side to side as you turn the hand wheel. The right-hand bolt does not have those washers, and it's used to set the tension to add the amount of friction that you want. For now, I'm leaving all of the screws in the linear bearings a little bit loose. That will allow me to slightly shift the bearings to adjust their exact position. This screw and a stack of washers goes in the middle of the Infeed stage, and that will serve as the end stop. And then these two end stop screws will go on the table to bump into that center screw on the Infeed stage. I have the ends of the linear rails wrapped in tape just so that they won't slide out of the bearings, but now I can take the tape off because the end stops will do that job. Here I'm just double checking that the end stops are lined up and doing their job, and then we can start aligning the rails. I'll set the first rail parallel to the edge of the table and tighten all of the screws in that rail. And then I'll set the second rail roughly parallel to the first. It doesn't have to be perfect, and I'm only going to tighten a couple of screws for now. We'll come back to this. So this can still turn slightly because the screws in the bearings are loose. So we're just going to feed it in until it's touching the platen, and now we can tighten these screws. And those 3 holes in the center of the table that had a separate template, those are just access holes for the Allen key. Remember how we left all but 2 of the screws loose in this back rail? Here we're going to loosen those 2 screws, and then we're going to slide the Infeed stage along, using it as a spacer while we tighten all of the screws in that rail. This will ensure that those 2 rails are exactly the right spacing apart. Let's add a knob to make it a little bit easier to slide this. This will just make it more ergonomic. The threaded rod goes in until it bottoms out on the linear rail below the hole. Then the lock nut goes on all the way, and then the knob goes on until it bottoms out. And now I'm going to back that lock nut out 1 round. That way, when I thread it in all the way, it bottoms out on the lock nut and not against the rail. The nice thing about this design is it all comes off as a single unit, so if it's ever in the way, I can just take it off easily. And finally, we need to square the table to the platen. We'll do this by loosening the bolts in the flexure, and that way the whole Infeed stage can tilt front and back. Adjust till it's square, and then tighten those bolts back up, and now it's just perfect. And that's it. It's done. Well, almost. It is usable like this, but there's one more thing I'm going to do. The top surface is not perfectly flat. It's quite good. I recommend using cold rolled steel for this because it's pretty flat to start with, but it's not perfect. And we can make it perfect by regrinding it. The first step to doing this is to build the regrinding jig. Now, I'm not going to do this because I already have one and I don't want to make another one, but it's extremely straightforward. It's just 3 pieces, as you can see. The plans include templates and step-by-step instructions for how to make this jig. I also recommend that you regrind your platen attachment, or if you're not able to do that, replace the platen surface so that it's nice and flat. Now we'll unbolt the bearings from the Infeed stage and remove the table. Take the end stop bolt out of the Infeed stage and put it into the regrinding jig. I'm sure some of you are going to notice that this regrinding jig has been reground. You can do that if you want to. I don't think it's super necessary, but I did it because it's pretty easy to do once you have the table working. I bring this up against the platen so that it's nice and square to the platen surface, and then tighten the screws. If I bring this up to the platen, I can see that the light gap is not even, so I need to adjust the angle a little bit. Otherwise, I'll just be grinding a ton off of the top for no reason. After doing that, I can put on the belt. I'm using a very coarse 24 grit belt. One last thing to check before we grind is that the platen is square to the table. So mine is definitely not. And I know that the platen is already square to the machine, so that means I have my table mounted crooked to the regrinding jig, so I'll need to loosen the bolts in the regrinding jig. This will just make sure that the grinding marks are straight in line with the table. It's just a visual thing, but it will be quite striking if they're crooked. You won't be able to quite grind all the way to the end, so there's going to be a little strip here on the end that's not ground. We'll come back and clean that up later, but because this doesn't slide all the way to the end, I'm fairly comfortable putting my hands on the end of the table to slide it. But if you're uncomfortable getting your fingers that close to the belt, what you can do is just take a piece of 1/4 inch thick flat bar, drill a 5/16 hole in the end, and put it under the end stop bolt instead of the stack of washers. That way you can just use this to push and pull on it. And it only took about 2 minutes of grinding to achieve this finish, but now I need to work on removing this end that is still kind of raised. We're going to do that by unbolting the entire regrinding jig and just moving it over. The rear edge of the table, which is currently facing downward, has these notches in the ends. They're kind of hard to see, but I'm going to align those to the edge of the platen and then set up an end stop at that location. From this angle, it's easier to see that notch and how it stops at the right spot. So the idea is that this center surface is really precise from our previous grind, but the ends are not. So the center between these two marks, between the notches, is going to be our reference surface, and then these ends will just be ground to be a little bit lower than the reference surface. They'll still be good for supporting clamps and things, but they will not be accurate. And I like to just mark that area with a Sharpie and then grind until the Sharpie marks are gone. And here I'm just making sure that that end area is lower than the reference surface. It's still high enough to clamp a piece of paper, so it's not even 5/1000 inch lower than the reference surface, but I can see here that it is in fact lower. And now I'm just moving the regrinding jig over, offsetting it to the other side, so that I can grind the high end on the other end of the table. And now we're all done, and we can take the regrinding jig off. Don't forget to move the end stop bolt over. It can be really tricky to get these screws into place with the table on top of the Infeed stage, so I recommend fishing the screws into place now and then putting it back on. And then you'll have to re-square it. It won't be quite right anymore. The surface is super clean right now, and so it will rust easily. So I just wipe a bit of oil into the surface, let it soak in for a bit, and then wipe off the excess. That's what I did on this table about a year ago, and while it is really scratched up now, it's still completely rust-free. Okay, that's it. It is actually done now, and that's the end of the video. I'm going to have another video coming out soon about the magnetic chuck and the hold-down clamps, and the plans for everything are already available. There's links in the description. And again, if you haven't already, I really recommend that you go check out the Unveiling video. I'll put a link in the description. It really shows off why this XY table is so capable. Thanks for watching.